Thank you. My Lord, your Lordship indicated in chambers that perhaps before we begin, your Lordship wanted to deal with the broadcasting issue.
Oh, yes. Thank you for reminding me. This is for the attention of the media, those who are operating the cameras here for the live stream recording. I've been informed that on Friday, for example, when the court adjourned at tea time, the cameras continued to operate, with the result that discussions that take place between counsel and the instructing attorneys or their clients gets picked up. Now, this is contrary to the order that this court gave when it allowed or gave permission for recording. So I would like to remind all media operators, camera operators, please ensure that you comply with the court order and the practice directive or manual of this court, which provides inter alia that as soon as the court rises, in other words adjourns, all cameras must stop recording. There is not to be any visual or, for that matter, even audio recording until the court resumes again. Please keep that in mind and adhere to the court order. Thank you. Mr. Mohan.
Thank you, my Lord. Will the plaintiffs call their next witness, Mr. Craig Patterson?
Yes.
On a matter of housekeeping, my Lord, we also seem to have come to resolution regarding the bundles, and they'll be dealt with during the tea adjournment.
Yes, fine.
John Patterson. Objection.
You will be seated here while you testify.
Mr. Patterson, if I could ask you to please speak up when you answer the questions. And if you could please direct your answers to His Lordship. Could you tell the court, Mr. Patterson, what it is that you do?
I'm an historian based at Rhodes University in Grahamstown. I lecture, I'm lecturing there at the moment, and I am finishing my PhD in history this year as well.
For those of us who may not know, just tell us briefly, if you can, what is it that an historian does?
Well, a historian will look at continuity and change in society. I think that's probably the best way of explaining it. Much of our job and much of the skill of being a historian comes down to knowing where to find information and how to ask questions around it. So we'll spend a lot of time going out and interviewing people and collecting their stories and analyzing those stories. We'll spend a lot of time going through archives and letters, looking at various different bits of information that can help us explain how change has occurred in society and what stays the same. It's also worth saying that when we're looking at these changes in society, we'll often find ourselves in the terrain of other disciplines. So we tend to look at very, very broadly at anything that will help us to understand the changes that have occurred in society.
Could I ask you to ensure that you have in front of you, please, file number 4 of 6. And if I could ask you to turn to page 848.
848.
848.
CV.
Could Could I ask you, Mr. Patterson, firstly, do you recognize this document?
Yes, this is the CV that I sent to you, yes.
This is your curriculum vitae.
Yes.
Could you just take us through some of your qualifications and experience with reference to this document?
Well, starting at the bottom, you can see I finished my Bachelor of Arts, majoring in History and Philosophy in 2006. Did my honours degree after that in History in 2007. 2008 was when I presented at the biennial conference of the Historical Association of South Africa, and there I presented on the cannabis trade. It was 2009, December, that I submitted my MA in History.
What is MA?
Master of Arts. And that MA was on the development and changes within the cannabis trade in Southern Africa. I graduated the following year, so submitting in December and then graduating at the next graduation. At that graduation, I was also awarded the Sol Memorial History Masters Prize, which is given to the best history masters of that specific graduation. Then I left universities for a while and came back 3 years later and enrolled for my PhD. My PhD started with me taking the opportunity to work on a research project on traditional horse racing in the Eastern Cape. And I then decided it was a fine topic to do my PhD research in. And I've been doing that ever since. 2015, I presented on part of that work. A lot of my interest is about policy and the way that history is used in our society. So I think it's particularly important in a post-apartheid and a post-colonial context that we need to look at the past. A lot of our political program deals with that past. And that 2015 paper was looking at ideas around that. Also in 2015, I worked as a senior researcher on the UNDP Communal Lands Project. That was looking at the way that the use of communal land, land management, how it relates to traditional authorities and customary law, has changed over the years from the pre-colonial era into the colonial era.
What does UNDP stand for?
A United Nations Development Program. Then from last year, I began working as a contract lecturer at the History Department at Rhodes. I'm doing that again this year, because this was submitted last year. It doesn't include this year's work. So there I lecture History 202. I'm lecturing that again this year. And last year I also lectured the History 321 course, which was on maritime history and mainly East Africa. The History 202 is Themes in Southern African History, and that is my lectures mainly deal with colonialism and the changes that colonialism brought in our society. For the PhD, now obviously 2017 is the 5th year of my PhD, and I'm on the Oppenheimer Memorial Trust Scholarship. I have been for the last 2 years. Prior to that, I was on the Mellon Foundation doctoral program for the initial 3 years. I think that covers it.
Could I ask you to turn to page 838?
838.
You recognize the document at page 838?
I do.
This is your expert summary.
Yes.
Page 839, first 3 paragraphs I think have been covered by what you've dealt with in your CV.
Yes.
But just observe in paragraph 1 it says, in December 2009, the expert submitted a thesis in fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Masters of Arts in History at Rhodes University titled Prohibition and Resistance, a socio-political exploration of the changing dynamics of the Southern African cannabis trade, 1850 to the present. Annexure B here too. We find Annexure B at page 849. If you could just confirm for us that that is the document referred to in paragraph 1.
Yes, that looks like it. Yes.
Back to page 839. After the first 3 paragraphs, the numbering starts again. It says, take notice that a summary of the expert's opinions and his reasons therefore are set out hereunder. It says in paragraph 1, in order to express the opinions and provide the reasons set out hereunder, the expert, and then 1.1 says, has researched relevant topics and extensively read historical sources in order to author the paper referred to above. Now, the paper referred to above, is that the thesis Annexure B that you referred to?
Yes, that'll be the thesis. May I?
Yes, if you could refer to
this.
the master's thesis, tell us briefly what exactly a master's thesis entails, and take us through your master's thesis.
Well, I think for the court there are 2 relevant points, perhaps 2. The first is that must be remembered this was written a few years ago, completed in 2009, and I know that the final chapters do deal a lot with the contemporary situation, which I recognize may have changed quite a lot. And I also have to say that a master's thesis is usually the first piece of research, and was for me, that's independently carried out by any researcher. In the years in between when I submitted this and now, my experience has grown. I believe I've improved, and there are elements of it that I should tell the court I'm not happy with my analysis. I think I've grown a lot more. I refer particularly to the sections using oral history methodologies, which was something I have improved on over the years, and I'm not happy with my analysis in here. So just bearing in mind I'm here to assist the court, I think that the oral history work, which will be parts of chapter 3 and chapter 4, I don't believe I could speak with confidence on. It's not relevant to this case as far as I can tell, which will deal mainly with chapters 1 and 2, and I'm very happy with my analysis there. I believe that it's sound, so I don't see it affecting my opinion in any way as it relates to this case, but I feel I probably should tell the court that. Yeah, I think that's...
For clarity, perhaps we could turn to Annexure B at page 849. 849, which is where the thesis commences, but perhaps with reference to the table of contents at page 841. Sorry, 851, I beg your pardon, 851. You sought to distinguish between chapters 1 and 2 on the one hand and 3 and 4 on the other hand.
Yes.
Just explain that distinction and confirm for us which chapters are relevant to this case and whether you confirm the correctness of the contents of those chapters.
Well, my understanding of this case and my reason for being invited to court today is to explain the processes of prohibition. With that, in my thesis, I use mainly archival research and going through various other sources that have dealt with this issue before and bringing them into one place. That's covered in chapters 1 and 2, predominantly chapter 2. Chapter 1 is background information to chapter 2. With that, like I said, I was using archival sources and secondary materials and my analysis and the analysis of other people. And there was chapter 3 and 4 where I was looking at more of the resistance side and the way that the cannabis trade developed, as opposed to the way that it was prohibited. And it's chapters 3 and 4 that I would like to reconduct that analysis. So as it relates to this case, chapter 1 and chapter 2 I'm very happy with, and in fact I'm more convinced of than I was at the time of writing. And chapter 3 and 4 I'm less convinced of, and it doesn't relate to this case.
You referred in your evidence a moment ago to a number of things such as archival sources, secondary material, and oral history methodologies. Could you explain those concepts to us, please?
Can you write it down?
Archival sources, secondary material, and oral history methodologies, or perhaps history methodologies.
Well, archival sources, we know that governments and companies and various groups would gather all of the documents that they used, a record of their proceedings, and courts do the same. And they're placed into an archive, and historians will go in and examine this archive. It's processing thousands of pages of material. Most will be useless for our purposes as little memos and notes, but part of the art of using archives is to see the trends, know what questions to ask when you're looking at archival sources, and then conduct an analysis from it. On that note, I think it's quite important for the court to understand what makes it different to someone who's not a historian looking at an archive. A good example, I think, would be the way that demographic information was collected during the 1850s, particularly as it relates to rural areas. Census information and that sort of thing.
Are you referring to South Africa specifically?
Yes, I'm referring to South Africa. It was common across the colonies, but South Africa in particular. Now, if you look at that information and take it at face value, you'll see X amount of people of such and such a tribe and such a gender and in a certain area, a number of households, and you can just take that as basic demographic information. A historian would be looking at it in a slightly different way and saying, well, in order for them to gather this information, they had to decide what information was important. So more interest to the historian would be looking at why they chose that category as important for governing. And by looking at that, we can say, why did they choose to have that box on the census? Why did they choose to classify this as a tribe or as a race? And work from there. And an archive will actually tell us more about the people building the archive than it will about the people the archive deals with. I think that covers that. Secondary material is
Before you move on to secondary material, could you just tell us, for the purposes of the opinions which you are to express in this hearing, and for the purposes of your master's thesis, which you will no doubt refer to, did you rely on these types of sources, archival sources?
Yes, I did, and I relied on the secondary material, which I'll get to in a second, from other people who had conducted other analyses of archives. When we're looking at this sort of process and state making and law making in history, we generally rely on archival material.
Secondary material?
Secondary material is simply material that other people have written. So rather than going to the archive myself, I would use the work of somebody else who had been to the archive.
And oral history methodologies?
Oral history methodologies deal with writing history by going out and collecting oral material. So we'll go out and we'll record the stories of an event and gather the history of an area through interviewing people and recording what they say and then analyzing what's recorded. It's a bit more complicated in the traditional history sense because the way that people describe the events that happened to them and how they remember things changed a lot over time. So if you interview someone one day and ask them what happened and they tell you a story and then you go back to them a year later and you ask them what happened and ask them about the same event, you'll find that there are changes in the way that they explain it and often contradictory things in the two interviews. So oral history methodology nowadays will rely a lot more on memory studies and the way that people construct representations of the past.
All right, so you were telling us about your master's thesis, what it is, in reference to paragraph 1.1 of your summary at page 839.
39, yeah.
You pointed out that it's Annexure B, which is the master's reference referred to. Is there anything there in particular that you'd like to draw our attention to before moving on?
I think I've informed you enough to carry on. We'll refer to the masters a lot as I go through, mainly in paragraph 2.
Of these different types of sources that you've mentioned to us, archival sources, oral history methodologies, secondary sources, how would you rank them in terms of reliability?
I would rank them all the same, to be honest. You'll have to take each source that you use on its own and assess its value. Archival sources are at least fixed, but you still have to read that archive. I don't mean just read it at face value, but read it critically. Secondary material, you'll find some secondary material is very poorly done. Some is very well done. And as part of being a historian is being able to assess secondary material and find out what's reliable and what isn't. In some cases, by actually going and testing the analysis. In other cases, it's not necessary. Oral history methodologies and writing about oral history will rely on completely different criteria for being quality work.
And did you conduct such an assessment of the sources that you rely on?
Oh yes, I always do. I have to. It's my job.
Paragraph 1.2 on page 839 says you've had regard to inter alia, and then under 1.2.1, the observations and conclusions made by him in reading studies and papers, which are inter alia, and then you refer to 6 subparagraphs.
Yes.
Take us through those and explain what they are.
Well, I was very aware, preparing for this testimony, that I'm here to provide the court with understanding. So when I selected these 6, it was in order for the court to fully understand what I was talking about. There's a lot more that's been written on all of these things. There are whole libraries on some of them. But I selected these for a very specific purpose. The first one is Channock's Making of South African Legal Culture, 1902 to 1936, Fear, Favour and Prejudice. It's a 2001 publication. That I chose because it was very influential in me formulating my opinion. I used it quite a lot during my master's work. And I attempted to build on that work by Channock. Now, Channock's book deals with the whole of South African legal culture as he saw it developing during this period. There are only a few pages that he speaks specifically about cannabis. But the framework, I think you'll find it particularly, if it's of interest to you, in chapters 2 and 4, chapter 4 criminology, chapter 2 methodology, provided a very good foundation for me to begin my analysis and to move beyond what Chanak had been saying. It's very interesting how he speaks about legal culture, where he will speak about the gap, as he calls it, between the legal ideal, which the courts must work with, and the way that the law plays out on the ground, the way that it's carried out by bureaucrats and policemen, and the experience of people, the law in action, I believe is how he puts it. I'll refer to Chanak later on where my opinion springs from his work. The second one I mentioned here is B.M. du Toit's Cannabis in Africa from 1980. Du Toit in that work did a very good job of gathering all the references to pre-colonial use of cannabis. And also he did a very good analysis, a linguistic analysis, of the development of words referring to cannabis in Africa. I'll refer to that a bit later when we talk about the origins in chapter 2. The third one mentioned there is Jim Mills's Colonial Africa and the International Politics of Cannabis. The reason I included that is because in that paper he discusses the way in which international politics played out with regard to the prohibition. So he deals a lot with South Africa's submission to the League of Nations, asking for cannabis to be included on the list of globally restricted substances, seconded by Egypt. And he goes into a bit of the debate there as well. Mills's other book, Madness, Cannabis and Colonialism, The Native-Only Lunatic Asylums of British India, is from 2000. Frankly, it's a brilliant history. He goes into extraordinary detail on the way in which the asylum systems in India and in the colonies in general, as we'll see a bit later on here, were used by the colonies to model society. And it's in that book when he deals with cannabis. He doesn't only deal with cannabis, it's an extensive study. But he shows quite convincingly that the reason with the place where the original link between insanity and cannabis use came from was from the Indian asylums. And in those asylums, there was a skewing of statistics involved, which I'll get into that a bit later as well. But I included that because it's a very important part of understanding how colonialism shaped our society and ended up with things like the connection between cannabis and insanity, historically. The final two that I included there deal with ethnopsychiatry, which is the idea that different races and ethnic groups' psyches evolved independently, and that a different functioning which meant that to be treated differently. The first one, Deacon's Madness, Race and Moral Treatment, is a very good analysis of the Robben Island, looking at how the emphasis on class and treating different classes differently became an emphasis on race and treating different races separately. The Empire's New Clothes, Ethnopsychiatry in Colonial Africa by McCulloch, that gives you an overview of how ethnopsychiatry functioned. It's also worth pointing out there that he gives you an idea of the depth that ethnopsychiatry went to when he discusses, for example, how the World Health Organization, right up to the 1970s, was using a racist psychiatry to understand the African psyche, and also looking at things like the overlap between the penal system and the asylum system, where he mentions that it was until 1944 that the West African colonies actually had the asylum system and the penal system working together in Africa, and links it to the racist psychiatry. I think that's all I've got to say on the readings here.
Then paragraphs 1.2.2 and 1.2.3 indicate that you've read the pleadings in the matter. Is that correct?
I have.
And that you've read the expert summaries of David Baeva and Professor Shabir Banu. Is that correct?
Yes, I have. I don't profess to understand all the medical information, but I have read them.
Paragraph 2, a summary of the experts' opinions incorporating limited reasons follows. Then there's a heading at paragraph 2.1, relevant history of cannabis prohibition in South Africa. There's a subheading, origins.
Yes.
And then in 2.1.1 it says cannabis has been used in various forms since prehistory for a variety of reasons by human beings all around the world. Tell us about that.
Yes. I'm just looking at what the next paragraph is there, seeing how much I should include in my response. Maybe the best way of describing this would be to refer to chapter 1 of my thesis. Let me just find the page for you that we can work from. Now, cannabis, there's a lot of debate about where it originated. You've got sites where it was used extensively, you've got sites where there's a lot of variation, and there are various different uses of it. Hemp being one, as a cereal, another, and then I'll lump all of the uses of THC into a third category. So medical use and as a recreational drug. I think historically for the evolution and development of the plant we can lump together. The most convincing for me, and maybe this is just because of my background, was the hypothesis that it developed north of the Taklamakan Desert in Central Asia, north of the Tibetan Plateau. And that convinces me because just understanding evolution, we've got other plants that we know evolved in that area that have similar characteristics to the plant. I'm very convinced by that. So from my perspective, that's where it developed. That said, I'm not a botanist, but from the arguments that are in place before me, it seems the most convincing to me. We can trace back the use of cannabis well over 1,000 years, quite likely much more. I'm not going to get too deeply into it except to say that there's mentions in a number of Indian writings. We find traces of the hemp plant used to imprint onto pottery in South Korea, dating back centuries and centuries. By the time Europeans arrived in the area we call South Africa, and all the reports of Africa that we find by Europeans referencing cannabis, it was here by the time that they arrived. The suspicion, if you turn to 879, you'll see a map of Africa there. This is a B.M. du Toit's diffusion hypothesis. The suspicion was that it was introduced by Arab traders. And the reason why it's believed to be introduced by Arab traders is based on the terms used for cannabis. Where there was direct contact with Arab traders, we see the term being the same as the term used by in Arabia to refer to cannabis. And then if you look at this, you can see that the further away from Arab contact that you go, the more the word changes. So we have Bangi, then becoming Lubange, then becoming Riamba, Mbanji, Mbanzi, as it moves further away from Arab contact. I find that fairly convincing, that this was introduced by Arab traders. Another thing is, if you look at all the mentions, the pre-colonial era and the early contacts between Europeans and cannabis, they never refer to it as a cereal or as a fiber. It's referred to as an intoxicant, and this makes sense considering this diffusion as well. We know that the Arab term for it, bangi, was derived from the Indian term for it, and we know that the Indian uses of the plant were growing it for THC rather than as a fiber or a cereal. So it appears that the cannabis plant developed in Central Asia, made its way all over Asia or Eurasia, came across the Himalayas into India, where it was extensively used as an intoxicant and in spiritual worship and as a medicine. But the point is, for THC, from there it moved over to Arabia through trade, and from Arabia moved down the coast of Africa, from which it spread across the continent. And I would confidently say that we can date it back at least to the 1500s, considering the terminology that's used to describe it. And we know that it was right at the southern tip of Africa by the time Jan van Riebeeck landed his boat.
1500s in Africa?
In South Africa.
South
Africa, yes. What have I covered there?
Yes, we were dealing with 2.1.1 and 2.1.2 on page 840 and 841,
Okay.
which I think you've covered.
All right.
2.1.3 make the point that in South Africa cannabis is referred to as Dagga.
Yeah, okay. Now, when we look at the references to Dagga, it's quite difficult to pick it apart. And to be honest, I'm not sure what the word Dagga actually meant. I'm not convinced by any one argument. The trouble here is that, first of all, there's a lot of different spelling. I suspect that the European way of hearing the Khoi and San languages wasn't very sound, so the spelling varied a lot over the years. At times, they seem to be referring to anything that intoxicates. At other times, they seem to be referring to anything that is smoked. At times, they seem to be referring to this plant specifically. So one thing we can say for certain is that the word Dagga is derived from these Khoi origins, but exactly what it meant, we're not sure. It came to refer to the cannabis plant specifically, probably in the 19th century.
2.1.4 on page 841. During the height of the colonial era, the ideas of social Darwinism and then I think there's a typo there, it's ethnopsychiatry, should be ethnopsychiatry, gained prominence and widespread acceptance in European colonies. Mm-hmm. A relevant summary meaning that, and then you set out a number of observations.
Yeah.
Can you take us through that? Tell us what is social Darwinism and ethnopsychiatry, and how does that impact the history?
I'll get into how it impacts the history in a minute, but let me lay out the concepts first. Social Darwinism is quite simply the application of Darwinian theory, so Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, to society. It's important because, I mean, Darwin's publications are probably some of the most influential texts ever written, certainly with our way of understanding the natural world. And the applications of it to society were an attempt to have a sort of scientific management of society, which was a big drive towards. I'll get to that in a second. Ethnopsychiatry, as I explained before, was the idea that different race groups and ethnic groups evolved with a different psychiatry and a different psyche, and so needed to be treated differently. These gained prominence, as I said, in Europe's colonies, and were very influential in the British colonies. We're talking about the second half of the 19th century here. Now, I've broken it down a little bit, and let me just go through each of these points. So say people believed that different races had evolved separately and in different environments, and thus had a distinct psyche and physical constitution. Now, that meant, just looking at Darwinism, the idea that over generations people will adapt, and there'll be slight differences over generations that suit people to the environment. It's a survival of the fittest is usually how we refer to it. Applying that to society, we're saying that different races, for example, will have their physical characteristics to suit a certain environment. So they'll be better equipped to survive in a certain environment. The implication being, if you take them out of that environment, they won't be quite as well equipped to survive. Just as if you look at animals and you take an animal that has evolved to live in a desert and you place it in the Arctic, its chances of survival are going to go down. There was something inherent in the biology in social Darwinism. So someone that had evolved in a different setting to someone else was inherently different. So the races had something about them, like a core. They refer to it as a nidus, which I believe means nest in Latin, where the core of the person is situated. They would have evolved over time. And yeah, from there we can see the idea of a different psyche emerging as well. So different races evolved in different places, and because of that were inherently different and operated inherently different.
We see it is adjournment at this stage. The court adjourns.